A stretch of frontier road winds through endless grassland, silent but for the creak of wagon wheels and the call of crows. Along this lonely route, an inn appeared plain, unremarkable, and yet unforgettable. Travelers remembered its hand-painted sign, "Rest and supper for weary guests." To some, it was a blessing. To others, it became the last place they were ever seen. Before we begin, I'll ask you something. Imagine you were on that road, hungry, exhausted, with night falling fast. Would you stop at the inn, or would you keep riding into the darkness? Tell me in the comments, and share the time of day you're listening from, because what follows is not just a story of vanishing travelers, it's the unraveling of a mystery that haunted this land for generations. The road that cut across this part of the frontier was less a road than a scar across the earth. In dry seasons, it became a ribbon of dust that clung to clothes and burned the lungs. In wet weather, it turned into sucking mud that pulled wheels and hooves deep into the muck. For travelers, merchants carrying their wares, families uprooted and seeking new homes, or solitary riders looking for work, each mile was a trial. Supplies ran thin quickly. A jug of water warmed under the sun, a sack of flour emptied faster than expected, a horse grew lame with no blacksmith for days in either direction. Nightfall brought its own dangers. Wolves howled across the prairie. Thieves sometimes watched the road from a distance, waiting for the desperate or the careless. So, when an inn appeared along such a stretch, travelers welcomed it as salvation. It was not grand. Its roof was patched, its fence crooked, its windows small and dim, yet it stood as one of the only signs of human presence in miles of emptiness. To those who passed, it seemed a miracle, a light where there should be none, a warm place where the wind tore mercilessly across the plains. The family who ran the inn were outsiders. No one in the nearest settlement, half a day's ride away, remembered them before they arrived. They had purchased their land in cash, neighbors would later recall, handing over coins without hesitation. Their story of origin shifted depending on who asked. To one person, they claimed to have come from the east. To another, from farther south. Few pressed for details. The frontier was full of wanderers reinventing themselves, and the scars of the Civil War made people reluctant to question too deeply. At first glance, they seemed respectable enough. The father, broad-shouldered and quiet, did most of the talking when business was at hand. His wife, stern and watchful, kept a careful eye on her household. Their son, grown but restless, seemed to spend much of his time pacing the yard, as though waiting for something on the horizon. Their daughter, pale and intense in her gaze, was often seen at the window, rarely speaking to strangers, but never failing to observe them. Neighbors noted oddities, but none serious enough to act upon. The family planted little, despite fertile soil. They kept animals, but only a few, and those in poor condition. Yet they purchased supplies in town: flour, coffee, nails, lamp oil, in amounts that seemed disproportionate to their needs. And always, they bought shovels. Too many shovels, one man would later say. Still, the inn gained a reputation. Wagoners mentioned it by name when they reached the next town. A bowl of stew and a bed for the night, they said. Fair price, no trouble. Others remembered the taste of the stew in particular, rich and heavy with spice. This was the contradiction of the place. On the one hand, it stood as a beacon in a hostile land. On the other, it inspired unease. A guest could not quite explain why, but more than one remembered a chill, as though unseen eyes lingered on them even as they sat by the fire. For months, perhaps longer, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Travelers came, ate, slept, left. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves in time, and as the seasons turned, whispers began to circulate in nearby settlements. Whispers of men who had been seen at the inn, but never seen again on the road beyond. The inn, with its crooked walls and dim windows, had already begun to cast a shadow longer than anyone realized. For every lonely inn that dotted the frontier, stories were bound to cling like dust. Some tales were of kindness, a free meal offered to a penniless traveler, a blanket shared on a bitter night. Others carried an edge of unease, whispered in taverns or around campfires. The inn on that barren stretch of road was no exception. The earliest surviving testimonies about the family and their house are fragmentary, drawn from diaries, letters, and scattered recollections decades later. Yet, when pieced together, They sketch a portrait that is hard to ignore. A cattle driver named Jonathan Rowe passed through in the spring of 1871. In his journal, discovered by his grandson many years later, he wrote, "Stopped at a small house with a sign promising food and rest, paid a fair price for stew. Rich taste, though heavy with spice. The father spoke little, the mother hardly at all. The daughter stared from the corner as if watching my every move. Could not sleep easy, though the bed was clean enough. A merchant named Samuel Briggs, whose route often carried him between river towns, gave a similar impression in a letter to his wife. The place looked sound enough. I was glad for supper after the long road, but I confess, I could not shake the sense that their kindness was studied, like a performance rehearsed too many times. The boy seemed eager, too eager, in helping me stable my horse. When I left at dawn, the father pressed me to stay another night. Strange folk, these were not accusations, merely observations. But with hindsight, such details took on new weight. Neighbors, too, noticed things. One woman, who lived a few miles away and occasionally crossed paths with the innkeeper's wife in town, later told her daughter, they bought more coffee and salt than a family of their size could ever use, and always they paid in coin. I never once saw them trade goods from their farm. Truth is, I don't know what they lived on. The same neighbor remarked that the daughter often lingered in the general store, silent, her eyes following customers rather than the shelves. She seemed to be listening more than looking. The woman recalled, at the blacksmith's shop, the son became known for strange purchases. Not just nails and tools, but heavy chains, too many to account for. When asked about it, he claimed they were needed for wagons breaking down on the road. The explanation satisfied no one, but in a land of limited oversight, questions went no further. Travelers, however, began to remember odd moments. One man, who stopped for a meal but declined a bed, later told a sheriff in a distant county, "The stew was filling, but I swear I grew drowsy after only a few spoonfuls. I rode on before it worsened, and by the time I reached the next town, the fog had lifted. Thought it must be fatigue. Now I wonder." Such recollections were only assembled much later. At the time, each was an isolated impression, hardly enough to stir alarm, but the ledger, the same small book where guests signed their names, would one day reveal absences difficult to explain. Still, some accounts praise the family's hospitality. A preacher remembered being given shelter from a thunderstorm, the family praying with him before bed. A young couple on their way west described the inn as a haven where they felt safe for the first time in weeks. This was the contradiction. Kindness and menace interwoven, depending on who you asked. And perhaps that is what made the place so insidious. If every guest left uneasy, suspicion would have spread quickly. But only some carried that heaviness with them, while others swore they had found friends in the wilderness. Years later, in a courthouse archive nearly forgotten, investigators would come across a series of anonymous notes written in pencil. One read, "I saw them in the yard at dusk. They dug as if planting, but no seed was ever sown. The earth swallowed their work, and the ground never bore fruit." Whether written by a neighbor or a passing traveler, the note captured the sense of unease that clung to the family like a shadow. The accounts varied, some praising, some warning, but together they planted a seed, a growing suspicion that the inn's walls held more than weary travelers and fading lamplight. And as summer turned to autumn, the first disappearance would force those whispers into something far darker. By the autumn of 1871, the road that passed the inn had grown busier. Harvest wagons rattled toward market towns, and merchants carried goods east and west in a constant shuffle of trade. Among them was a man named Henry Cartwright, a merchant known for reliability. He was not wealthy, but he was respected, a familiar face in small settlements across the region. Cartwright kept careful schedules. He wrote to his wife before every trip, noting the towns he would visit, the dates he expected to return. In late September, he departed with a wagon of cloth and household goods. His letter promised he would be back within 10 days. He never returned. At first, his absence caused little alarm. The frontier devoured time as easily as it did men. Roads washed out, horses went lame. Accidents delayed even the most careful traveler. But as weeks passed, unease spread. His wife made inquiries, sending word along the merchant routes. Yes, he had been seen. Witnesses recalled his wagon on the main road, his stop at a river ford, his presence in a nearby market town, and then, nothing. The last confirmed sighting placed him heading north, toward the lonely stretch where the inn stood. Rumors began, quiet at first. A storekeeper in the next town mentioned that Cartwright had spoken of stopping at the inn for a meal before nightfall. Another traveler thought he glimpsed the merchant's wagon outside the building, though he admitted it was growing dark and he could not be certain. When word reached the county sheriff, he made a note in his ledger. Missing person. Last known destination. Uncertain. Possible accident or theft. No evidence for foul play. The frontier was filled with such notations, most of which ended without resolution. Men disappeared into rivers, into storms, into the dust of the prairie. But Cartwright's wife refused to let the matter fade. She rode with her brother to the settlements along the road, asking after her husband's fate. It was then she heard the first unsettling remark. A peddler told her he had once lodged at the inn and awoke to find the daughter of the household watching him silently from the corner of his room. When he stirred, she vanished like a shadow. Another man recalled the son urging him to stay another night, pressing the offer with an insistence that unsettled him. These stories, though vague, troubled her. She returned home with no answers, but with a sense that something was deeply wrong. Months later, her persistence led a newspaper in a nearby city to publish a small notice. Local merchant unaccounted for. Last seen traveling northward along County Road. Family requests information from any who may have witnessed his passage. The article mentioned the inn only in passing, as a landmark. Few readers would have paused over it. Yet, in hindsight, that brief mention marks the first time the inn's name entered the public record in connection with a disappearance. Still, no formal investigation followed. Resources were scarce. Lawmen stretched thin across vast distances. Unless bodies were found or valuables stolen, suspicion alone was not enough. Cartwright's absence was recorded as unfortunate but unremarkable, a man lost to the hazards of the trail. Years later, during courthouse renovations, officials discovered papers misfiled in a wooden chest. Among them was a note, unsigned, describing the discovery of a wagon wheel buried in loose soil not far from the inn. Whether the wheel belonged to Cartwright's wagon was never established. The note ended abruptly. Ground disturbed. May require further digging. No, follow-up was recorded. That silence in the record speaks volumes. Whatever was or was not found, it never reached the public. In the moment, the disappearance passed quietly into the long list of frontier mysteries. Families grieved, neighbors whispered, and the road carried on. But in the wake of Cartwright's vanishing, a shadow lengthened. Travelers began to glance more warily at the inn as they passed. Some still stopped, too tired to care. Others pressed their horses harder, determined to reach the next town before nightfall. The family at the inn remained outwardly unchanged. They greeted guests, served stew, offered beds. Yet, to those who remembered later, a shift could be felt. A heavier silence at the table, a look that lingered too long, a sense, however faint, that the walls of the house were watching. The first disappearance did not end the inn's business, but it planted a seed, and once a seed of suspicion takes root, it is only a matter of time before others begin to see patterns, where once there were only coincidences. The ledger was a plain book, bound in worn leather, its corners frayed from use. Every inn kept such a record: names of travelers, dates of arrival, the coins they paid, perhaps a note of where they claimed to be headed. For years it sat quietly beneath the counter, each page a fleeting imprint of lives passing through. But when townsfolk later spoke of the inn, it was this ledger they mentioned most, not because it was kept with unusual care, but because of what was missing. A farmhand named Peter Lowe remembered glimpsing the book one evening while paying for his supper. The pages were torn, he told a friend years later. 2, maybe 3. Pulled right out. The edges ragged. I saw initials on the corner of one still clinging, but no names to read. When I asked, the father shut the book quickly and told me it was nothing. Others noticed strange marks. Besides certain names, an X had been drawn. Next to others, faint notations, numbers perhaps, or symbols whose meaning was unclear. No one questioned it then. Only later, when the names marked with an X matched the memories of those who never returned, did the pattern strike with its full weight. Rumors fed on such fragments. In the general store, someone remarked that the family bought far too much salt, more than needed for ordinary cooking. In the tavern, another swore he heard muffled sounds at night when he camped not far from the inn, as though voices were carried on the wind, pleading before being cut short. And then there was the daughter's diary. It surfaced decades later, found among a collection of forgotten papers. The handwriting was small, uneven, the entries brief. Most spoke of weather, of chores, of the endless monotony of life on the road. But scattered among them were unsettling lines. I heard the cries again beneath the floor. Mother told me not to listen. They came in at dusk. Father said the road takes more than it gives. I watched from the stair, and they were gone by morning. The pages containing these entries were smudged, as though pressed by anxious fingers. Scholars debate whether the diary is authentic or forged to match the rumors. Yet even with doubt, its words echo the unease that surrounded the family. Stories multiplied. A blacksmith's apprentice claimed the son once purchased iron fittings shaped like rings, and when asked what for, he laughed, but gave no answer. A farmer swore he saw the mother digging in the yard by lantern light, though when pressed he admitted it could have been no more than shadows in the distance. Whispers travel fast in places where boredom and fear mingle. By the winter, following Henry Cartwright's disappearance, the inn's reputation had shifted. Some still saw it as a refuge. Others muttered that to stop there was to risk never being seen again. One account, preserved in a faded letter, describes a traveller who knocked on the door late at night and was refused entry. The father said the rooms were full, but I saw no horses in the stable, no light in the upper windows. I rode on, and perhaps it saved me. It was not proof, not yet, but it was enough to seed doubt deep in the community's mind. The ledger, the diary, the whispers, they built a picture that grew sharper with every telling. Still, the law required more than suspicion. Without bodies, without witnesses, what case could be made? For the moment, the family at the inn carried on. They smiled at guests, served stew, offered beds, and as long as no one could point to anything certain, the road remained theirs to watch. But fate has a way of answering rumors with events, and soon, a traveller would escape with a story that could not be ignored. By the winter of 1871, the road grew harsher. Snow crusted the earth, wagons sank into drifts, and each journey carried the weight of risk. Yet despite the season, people kept traveling, compelled by business, by hope, or by necessity. And the inn still stood as the only refuge for miles, its lantern burning against the darkness. But the whispers that clung to the family had spread too far to be ignored. In the nearby settlement, a preacher delivered a sermon that struck listeners as strange. He spoke of the biblical warning against wolves in sheep's clothing, of those who offer bread but conceal harm in their hands. He never named the inn, never named the family. Yet his words carried a weight that set the congregation murmuring. Afterward, more than one parishioner admitted they thought immediately of the crooked house along the road. Merchants compared notes. Some recalled travelers who had promised to meet them in the next town but never appeared. Others remembered stopping at the inn and waking with unusual fatigue, as though sleep had been heavier than it should have been. Neighbors too found their doubts sharpening. They noticed that the family purchased salt far beyond what was reasonable, and in quantities no farm could justify. One shopkeeper told a friend, "I have sold them sacks of the stuff. Too much for their table, too much even for preserving meat." They gave no reason, only coin. Another recalled how often they bought shovels. They wore them down fast, they claimed. But how often can a spade break in soil like ours? Individually, these observations seemed small. Together, they formed a pattern, a rhythm of unease that beat steadily against the family's outward courtesy. Even travelers began to sense something amiss. One man later testified that he felt watched during his stay. At night, I heard footsteps in the hall, slow, deliberate. When I rose to look, the corridor was empty. Another swore he heard the sound of digging outside his window long past midnight. Still, without proof, the suspicions remained unspoken in official circles. The sheriff, when asked, shrugged. Men vanish every season. The land swallows them. Unless you find a body, there's no case. But for the common folk, the stories piled up. At the blacksmith's forge, men whispered of chains purchased for no reason. At the tavern, they traded tales of travelers too weary to resist a meal or a bed, and of those who vanished without trace. The inn's reputation became a dividing line. Some insisted it was harmless, a godsend for the road. Others swore it was cursed ground, a place to be avoided, even if it meant riding through the night. And the family? They carried on as before, offering food, rest, and smiles that seemed depending on who remembered, either kindly or too carefully rehearsed. What no one could deny was this: unease had settled over the community like frost on the prairie grass. Every disappearance was now measured against the inn. Every rumor pointed its way. It was only a matter of time before suspicion turned into something harder, when a traveler would not only feel unease, but escape with a story that could not be dismissed. The winter roads broke men as easily as they broke wheels. One bitter night, near the year's end, a lone traveler sought shelter at the inn. His name, preserved in later accounts, was Elias Turner, a drifter who moved from town to town, offering his labor. He carried littlesome tools, a worn coat, and a horse as weary as himself. Turner's story would become the first direct account that cast the inn in an unmistakably sinister light. According to his statement, he arrived at dusk. The lantern glowed in the window, and smoke rose from the chimney. Inside, he was welcomed as any guest might be. The father nodded. The mother set stew before him. The son led his horse to the stable, and the daughter watched silently from her place near the hearth. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The meal was hearty, though heavily spiced. Turner ate gratefully, warming himself by the fire, but as the evening passed, he began to feel a weight pressing upon him, not only in his limbs, but in the air itself. His eyes grew heavy. His thoughts clouded. He later swore it was not the ordinary weariness of the road. Something stronger seemed to tug at him, pulling him towards sleep. The family offered him a room. The bed was simple, the blanket rough, but after days on the trail, he welcomed the comfort. Yet as he lay down, a sound reached him, faint, muffled, from beneath the floorboards. At first, he thought it the wind in the beams. Then it came again, a noise like a stifled cry. Turner's heart quickened. He rose, pressing his ear to the floor. The sound faded, replaced by silence. He told himself he was imagining things, that exhaustion had conjured voices where none existed. But then, as he turned toward the door, he noticed something else. The bed he had been given stood directly above a section of the floor where the planks were newer than the rest, their color lighter, their edges crudely fitted, and in the half-dark, he thought he saw the outline of a trapdoor. Panic sharpened him. Whatever fog dulled his mind gave way to fear. He gathered his things quietly, each creak of the floor sounding louder than thunder. When he stepped into the hallway, he saw no one. The house was silent, but the silence felt wrong, as though it waited. Down the stairs, past the dimly burning lantern, out into the yard, where the cold air bit his skin like knives. His horse stamped nervously, as if sensing his alarm. He led it quickly away, not daring to mount until distance stood between him and the house. Turner rode through the night, half blind from fatigue and fear. By dawn, he reached the next settlement. His story poured out in fragments of voices under the floor, of the strange heaviness that seized him after the meal, of his terror when he realized the bed seemed placed above a hidden opening. The men who listened laughed at first, dismissing it as drunkenness or road weariness. But Turner swore his truth, his face pale, his hands trembling, and the details he gave, the uneven planks, the muffled cries, were too precise to ignore. Word spread quickly. For the first time, the whispers about the inn were not just rumor. They carried the weight of a living man's testimony. The sheriff, when told, remained cautious. "Fear makes men see shadows," he said. "Unless bones are found, there is no crime." Yet even he admitted that Turner seemed genuinely shaken. The community divided. Some claimed Turner had saved his own life by fleeing. Others insisted he had imagined it all. But one truth was undeniable. The inn's shadow now stretched longer than ever before. Travelers passed with quickened pace, eyes fixed on the horizon, and those who still entered its door did so knowing they might not emerge again. By early spring of 1872, Turner's story had taken root. It was repeated in taverns, whispered in churchyards, and carried by wagoners along the road. Some embellished it, claiming he had seen chains beneath the floor, or that he heard more than cries, but pleas for mercy. Others cut it down, saying he had been feverish, his senses muddled by fatigue. Still, the rumor had weight, and weight demanded action. A group of townsmen, unsettled by the growing tales, resolved to ride to the inn together. They carried no warrant, but frontier justice seldom waited for parchment and ink. They meant only to ask questions, they told themselves, to put the matter to rest. But when they arrived, they found no one to question. The house stood silent. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The door, when pushed, gave way without resistance. Inside, the air was cold, the hearth dead. On the table lay a half-finished meal, bread hardened to stone, a stew congealed in its bowl. The beds upstairs were neatly made, coats hung in place, belongings scattered as though abandoned in haste. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned chairs, no broken glass, no blood. The family had vanished, as if the walls had swallowed them whole. Outside, the yard showed confusion. Footprints crisscrossed the thawing ground, some leading toward the stables, others vanishing into the fields. The stable itself was empty. Their horses were gone. A wagon wheel track curved north, shallow in the soft earth, then disappeared. Where the grass grew thick, the search party called out, their voices echoing against the quiet. No answer came. They searched the cellar, finding jars of food preserved in brine, sacks of flour, barrels of salt. Nothing unusual, save for the sheer volume, and in the far corner, earth newly turned, as though something had been buried or unearthed. The men stood there for a long time, but none volunteered to dig. When they left, they locked the door with a nail hammered across the frame, a crude sign to others that the house was not to be entered. Word spread that the family had fled. Some said they had feared discovery after Turner's tale. Others whispered that vengeance had already caught them, that a victim or his kin had come quietly in the night, and the family had paid in kind. For weeks, travelers avoided the road altogether. Merchants rerouted their journeys, even if it meant days of delay. The inn's lantern no longer burned, but its shadow lingered all the same. When, months later, the sheriff rode out with a deputy to make an official inspection, they found the house unchanged. Dust now coated the surfaces. Rats had gnawed at the stores. The half-eaten meal remained, untouched, a grotesque tableau of interrupted life. The sheriff noted in his report, family absent, no clear sign of where or why, property abandoned in strange condition, investigation postponed until further evidence. And so the matter was left formally unresolved, yet deeply unsettling. The family had disappeared, their house preserved in eerie stillness, like a stage set after the actors had fled. The inn, once a refuge, was now a ruin of suspicion. Yet mysteries rarely stay buried forever, and in time, men would return to that silent house, prying open the floorboards, the cellar, and the earth itself, uncovering what the vanished family had tried and failed to keep hidden. The spring thaw brought with it both mud and curiosity. By late March of 1872, the story of the vanished family had grown too large to ignore. Merchants demanded answers, settlers pressed for safety, and so at last the county sheriff organized a formal search. The party numbered a dozen men, the sheriff, his deputy, and volunteers drawn from the nearest settlement. They rode under a grey sky, the wind carrying the scent of damp earth and thawing grass. When they reached the inn, its silence pressed heavier than before. The nailed door still bore the crude warning left by the earlier searchers, untouched in the weeks since. Inside, dust had begun to settle over the half-eaten meal. Mice scurried across the floorboards. The men moved cautiously, as though stepping into a place where time had stopped. They began with the obvious. Cupboards were emptied, trunks opened, shelves examined. Nothing of consequence emerged. Clothing, dishes, tools, all ordinary, all abandoned. The sheriff wrote in his notes, "Household effects, consistent with normal use. No evidence of theft or struggle." But it was the floor that drew attention. In the main room, near the hearth, one man tapped with his boot, and found the boards hollow. Kneeling, they discovered a section of planks newer than the rest, their edges misaligned. With a crowbar, the boards came free, revealing a dark cavity beneath. The air that rose from it was cold, stale, touched with a faint odor none could name. In the space lay a collection of objects. A torn coat, its lining ripped, a pair of boots, too large to belong to the innkeeper's son, a satchel containing scraps of paper letters half written, never sent, and coins, scattered loose, as though dropped in haste. No bodies, no blood, only possessions that clearly belonged to someone not of the household. The sheriff's report phrased it carefully. Personal effects of uncertain ownership located beneath flooring, possible left by former lodgers, items secured for record. The men who stood around the hole were less cautious in their thoughts. One muttered that he recognized the boots as similar to those worn by Henry Cartwright. Another swore he had seen the satchel before, in the hands of a peddler who had passed through the settlement months earlier, but speculation was not proof. Without bodies, without names clearly inscribed, the items remained circumstantial. The search continued to the cellar. There, between barrels of salt and sacks of flour, they found soil that had been disturbed. Packed unevenly against the wall, they dug briefly, striking nothing but stone and roots. The sheriff, wary of stirring hysteria without certainty, ordered the hole left as it was. By day's end, the party had combed the house, the stable, the yard. They found tracks leading north, but no trail beyond the fields. The family's fate remained unknown. The sheriff closed his report with a line that reflected both the limits of his authority and the weight of what he sensed but could not say. Evidence insufficient for further action at this time. Property to remain under observation. For the community, the search answered little. If anything, it deepened the mystery. Objects belonging to strangers had been found beneath the floor, but no explanation followed. The family was gone. Their trail vanished, and so the house stood, locked once more, its silence heavier than before. Children were warned not to wander near. Travelers crossed themselves as they passed. The first search had not ended the matter. It had only opened a door, one that would not easily be closed again. For a time, the story of the vanished family faded, as frontier life demanded attention elsewhere. The house sagged into disrepair. Weather stripped its paint. Storms loosened its roof. Weeds climbed over its fence. Children dared each other to run past at night, whispering of ghosts within. But as years turned to decades, memory thinned, and the inn became little more than a cautionary tale told around firesides. It might have ended there, as so many frontier mysteries did, had it not been for an accident of history. In 1903, the county courthouse underwent renovations. Old records, boxes of brittle paper, bound volumes, notes scrawled in fading ink, were moved, catalogued, and in some cases, nearly discarded. Among them was a set of documents long misfiled in the wrong drawer. When clerks opened the packet, they found the original sheriff's notes from 1872, along with something unexpected. Pages of testimony and observations never entered into the official record. The handwriting was hurried, the ink blotted in places, as though written under pressure. One entry described how, during the first search, a deputy had wandered into the yard and uncovered disturbed earth near the fence line. Digging a few feet, he struck something solid, what appeared to be bone. The deputy noted the find, but at the sheriff's order, covered it again. Why? The notes suggest a fear of inflaming panic. Community already restless. One line reads, "Without certainty of human remains, better to leave ground undisturbed." Yet the description was clear. Fragments resembling a jawbone, accompanied by rusted metal buttons. Another page referred to objects in cellar soil resembling grave goods, cloth remnants, corroded buckles. No further detail was given. The notes ended abruptly, with a final sentence. Matters not suitable for public disclosure at this time. When these papers came to light 3 decades later, they caused quiet uproar among local historians. Why had the evidence been withheld? Was it incompetence, fear of scandal, or deliberate concealment? The sheriff had long since passed away, leaving no chance for questions. Newspapers in 1903 ran short columns about the rediscovery. Headlines read, "Old Mystery Revisited Documents Hint at Graves Near Abandoned Inn." Citizens debated once more whether the family had been guilty of crimes or victims themselves. Some claimed the sheriff had protected them, fearing mob justice. Others believed the family's disappearance was punishment enough, and that the truth had been buried along with them. The house, by then, had collapsed into ruin. Only its foundation remained, stones half buried in weeds. Yet the rediscovered notes breathed new life into the legend. Stories of travelers vanishing, of cries under the floorboards, of Turner's escape, all were retold with fresh urgency. And though the century had turned, the unease was the same. People walked past the site and felt a chill. Farmers avoided ploughing too near the old yard. Children dared each other not only to run past, but to press their ears to the ground, swearing they could hear voices. The rediscovery did not solve the mystery, it sharpened it. For what had once been rumor was now tethered to ink and paper, official notes, suppressed, but not erased. It left the community with a haunting thought. If bones had been found and reburied in silence, what else might lie hidden beneath the earth of that quiet farmstead? By the time the courthouse documents resurfaced in 1903, nearly everyone connected to the original events was long gone. What remained were fragments. Turner's testimony, the ledger with its missing pages, the sheriff's suppressed notes, and a house that no longer stood. In the absence of answers, theories multiplied. Some were sober attempts at explanation, others fueled by fear and folklore. All shared one trait: none could fully resolve the mystery. The first theory was flight. According to this view, the family fled in haste. Once suspicion grew too strong, Turner's escape had spread unease, and Cartwright's disappearance had sharpened whispers. Perhaps the family feared exposure. By abandoning their home suddenly, leaving meals half-eaten and belongings scattered, they meant to create confusion, to disguise their departure as something more sinister. Supporters of this theory pointed to the wagon tracks leading north, to the absence of horses in the stable. They argued that the family had simply vanished into the anonymity of the frontier, changing their names and beginning again elsewhere. But the flaw was evident. Why leave so much behind? Coats, tools, even food left in the pot. For a family experienced in hardship, such waste seemed careless, even reckless. And if they had fled, why had no trace of them ever surfaced again? No records, no sightings, no new names that could be linked. The second theory was vengeance. Here, the family was cast not as fugitives, but as victims. Perhaps they had indeed preyed upon travelers. Perhaps a relative of one of those lost had come quietly, bringing frontier justice. The meal left half-eaten was explained as sudden interruption. The abandoned coats as evidence of a flight cut short. The suppressed notes about bones and disturbed soil lent weight to this view. If graves had been found near the property, they suggested crimes had been committed. And if the family vanished immediately after suspicion spread, perhaps it was because someone else decided their reckoning had come. Yet this theory too faltered. If vengeance had been taken, why had no one claimed it? On the frontier, men did not always fear boasting of such justice. Silence suggested either innocence or something darker still. The third theory was betrayal within. This was the most disturbing, and the one whispered most often. It held that the family turned upon itself. Some said the father grew weary of their deeds, others that the son sought to leave and was silenced. Still others believed the daughter's diary, if genuine, hinted at a conscience too fragile to bear the weight of what she heard beneath the floorboards. According to this view, what seemed an abandonment was in fact the aftermath of violence within the family. One killed another, or several killed one, and the survivors fled before the truth was uncovered. The meal left unfinished fit this version, a quarrel breaking out mid-supper, ending in sudden disappearance. The weakness of this theory lay in the lack of evidence. No bodies of the family themselves were ever found. If betrayal had occurred, it left no trace save rumor. Historians debated endlessly. One insisted the family had been confidence tricksters, their disappearances timed with the pressure of suspicion. Another argued they had been murdered by an unknown hand, their remains hidden in ground, yet unsearched. A third believed the inn's collapse into ruin mirrored a collapse within, a story of greed and guilt consuming itself. What united all these explanations was their insufficiency. Each solved one piece but left another unanswered, and so the legend of the inn remained unresolved. Its power not in certainty, but in the impossibility of certainty. A family that arrived without a past, that departed without a trace, leaving behind only objects that should not have been theirs, whispers of voices in the floor, and a half-eaten meal that cooled while the road carried on. When certainty fails, stories take root, and in the years that followed the family's disappearance, the empty inn became less a house than a symbol, its mystery woven into the folklore of the region like threads too tangled to separate. Parents warned their children, "Do not wander the old road after dusk. Do not drink from wells that stand untended, and never trust a stranger who offers a meal too freely." The warnings were practical enough on their surface, but all carried the shadow of the vanished family. Children dared each other to run past the ruins. Some claimed that if you pressed your ear to the ground near the crumbled foundation, you could hear muffled voices, rising faintly like echoes of the past. Others swore the lantern still appeared in the window on stormy nights, glowing faintly, though the house no longer stood. In the taverns, the tale became a story for travelers. Merchants new to the county would be told of the inn, the family that welcomed guests, and the ledger with its missing names. The telling always ended the same way, with the half-eaten meal still waiting on the table, a supper interrupted by something no one could name. Preachers, too, made use of the story. The inn became a cautionary image in sermons. The danger of hidden sin, the certainty that wickedness cannot remain buried forever. Some claimed the family had been punished by God, taken from their home in the night as judgment for their deeds. Others spoke more darkly, suggesting they had bargained with forces unspoken, and that their sudden disappearance was the price demanded. The story changed with each retelling. In some versions, the family had preyed upon travelers until one escaped to reveal their secret. In others, they were innocent victims of a curse placed on the land, their disappearance proof of powers beyond human reckoning. Still others blended both, guilty of wickedness, yet caught in a fate more terrible than the law could provide. What all versions shared was the fear of hospitality turned inward, of trust betrayed. The inn, once a place of warmth on a cold road, had become a symbol of danger, a reminder that not every fire offered safety, not every meal kindness. By the turn of the century, the story had spread beyond the county. Newspapers printed it as local color, an eerie tale from the frontier. Traveling storytellers included it in their repertoire, embellishing details to suit their audience. One version told that the cellar still held bones stacked like cordwood. Another, that the daughter's diary ended with a line scrawled in panic, "They are coming for us tonight." None of it could be proven. Yet the absence of proof only fed the imagination. Fear has a way of enduring longer than fact, and so the house that once promised rest and supper for weary guests lived on, not in stone or timber, but in the caution of travelers and the whispered warnings of parents to their children. Legends, however persistent, often draw seekers, those unwilling to accept folklore without evidence. By the middle of the 20th century, the story of the vanished family had become part of the county's identity, retold in schoolhouses and local fairs. For some, that was enough. But for historians and journalists, the unanswered questions were too tempting to ignore. In 1957, a team from the State Historical Society visited the site. By then, little remained of the inn, but its stone foundation, half sunken in weeds. The cellar had collapsed in on itself, a jagged pit filled with rubble and roots. The yard lay quiet under the sweep of tall grass, though locals warned the visitors not to linger after sunset. The investigators carried notebooks, shovels, and a cautious sense of purpose. Their work was not forensic in the modern sense, more archaeology than crime scene study. But what they unearthed stirred debate nonetheless. Near the foundation, they uncovered a corroded belt buckle, its style dated to the early 1872s, far finer than anything the frontier family might have owned. Alongside it lay fragments of cloth, the weave too delicate for farm work. Deeper in the soil, they found what one report described only as bone material of uncertain origin. The pieces were small, brittle, and weathered, perhaps animal, perhaps not. The team, lacking resources for analysis, catalogued them without conclusion. At the old well, long, dry, and choked with debris, they lowered a line. It struck something metallic. When hauled up, it revealed a rusted chain, its links heavy, the kind used not for wagons, but for restraint. No explanation followed. The report filed with the Historical Society noted the find, but offered no interpretation. Newspapers seized upon these discoveries with predictable fervor. Headlines read, "Bones found at haunted inn site, legend revived." Stories recounted Turner's escape, Cartwright's disappearance, and the family's vanishing, weaving the new artifacts into old suspicions. Locals, some fascinated, others fearful, flocked to see the site. Children dared each other to approach the collapsed cellar. Farmers muttered that disturbing the ground would only stir what should be left buried. The county board, unsettled by the attention, ordered the site sealed. The pit was filled in, the well capped with concrete, the ground left to grass and silence once more. Yet the legend could not be so easily contained. In 1974, a graduate student researching frontier folklore tracked down the rediscovered sheriff's notes from 1903, combining them with the artifacts unearthed in the 1950 seconds. She argued that the site provided rare evidence of ritualized violence on the frontier. Her thesis suggested that the family had not merely preyed on travelers for profit, but had practiced acts designed to instill fear and control. It was speculation, but compelling enough to spark debate in academic circles. Some dismissed her conclusions as sensationalism. Others argued that the consistency of the accounts, Turner's testimony, the ledger's missing names, the deputy's suppressed notes, the artifacts from the yard was too strong to ignore. Still, nothing definitive emerged. The bones remained uncertain. The chain could be explained away as equipment for livestock. The buckle might have been lost by a passerby. Every piece of evidence hovered in a fog between the ordinary and the sinister. And so, just as in 1872, the matter remained unresolved. The later investigations did not end the story. They gave it new life. By the century's close, the inn had become more than a mystery. It was a mirror, reflecting whatever fears or fascinations people carried into it. Justice avoided, evil unpunished, or simply the reminder that some doors, once opened, never close completely. By the dawn of the 21st century, the vanished family and their inn no longer existed as physical presences. The stones of the foundation had been scattered, the well capped, the cellar filled. The prairie had reclaimed the land, tall grasses swaying where once the sign had read, "Rest and supper for weary guests." Yet the story refused to die. The County Historical Society, recognizing the fascination the tale still inspired, erected a modest marker near the site in 1987. The plaque was brief, careful with its words. Site of Frontier Homestead, 1871, 1872, associated with accounts of unexplained disappearances. Local tradition regards it as a place of mystery. The phrasing avoided accusation, but the implication was clear. Tourists began to visit. Some came out of curiosity, others with notebooks and cameras, eager to capture the atmosphere of a place long whispered about. Local guides obliged, offering tours that combined fact with folklore, retelling Turner's escape. The ledger, with its missing names, the half-eaten meal left behind. Each retelling added a layer, polished by repetition, until history and legend fused into one seamless narrative. Television, too, played its part. In the 1990 seconds, several documentary programs on unsolved mysteries featured the case. Grainy reenactments showed actors eating stew by firelight, then vanishing into shadow. Experts debated the theories: flight, vengeance, betrayal. The programs offered no conclusions, but they left audiences with the same chill that had haunted the road more than a century before. For locals, the tale became part of identity. School teachers wove it into lessons about the frontier, balancing warnings with pride that their county held one of the great enduring mysteries of the Midwest. Festivals included storytelling sessions where children sat wide-eyed as elders recounted the cries under the floorboards, the unfinished supper, the sudden vanishing. Some treated it lightly, a ghost story to entertain tourists. Others took it more seriously, seeing in the tale a reflection of darker truths, that isolation breeds secrecy, that human nature is not always to be trusted, that the past leaves shadows we cannot fully measure. Researchers continued to publish. Articles appeared in regional journals analyzing the case as folklore, as criminology, even as early psychology. Some focused on the sheriff's decision to suppress evidence, framing it as an example of authority struggling against public fear. Others emphasized the cultural afterlife of the story, how communities need mysteries to anchor their imagination, even if answers remain elusive. What remained consistent was the fascination. Each generation found its own use for the inn's legacy. To some, it was a tale of caution. Beware the kindness of strangers. To others, it was a symbol of mystery's power to endure. And through all the retellings, one detail always lingered: the image of a table, left as it was, food cooling in bowls, as though life had been interrupted mid-breath. That moment, frozen forever, became the emblem of the story. Modern memory has not resolved the case, but it has ensured it will not be forgotten. More than a century and a half has passed since the family first raised their crooked house by the roadside, and still, the questions remain. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why did they vanish so suddenly, leaving meals uneaten, coats on their hooks, possessions abandoned as though the world had shifted in an instant? No ledger can answer. No testimony, no artifact, no rediscovered note has brought certainty. What remains is not resolution but shadow, and perhaps that is why the story endures. The frontier was filled with hardship, and men and women vanished often into rivers, storms, or silence. Yet this case lingered because it offered too many signs, too many whispers pointing towards something deliberate. A ledger with missing names, a traveler who swore he heard cries beneath the floorboards, a deputy's note about a jawbone in the yard, a cellar filled with salt and disturbed earth. Each fragment small, together impossible to dismiss, and so the inn became a symbol larger than itself. It was never only about one family or one road. It came to represent the precarious balance of trust in a land where strangers depended on each other to survive, and where that trust could be twisted into danger. Historians debate, criminologists speculate, folklorists gather versions told in barns, taverns, and classrooms. Yet the story refuses to be pinned down. Every attempt to fix it in certainty leaves gaps. Every theory explains some pieces, but not all. The mystery resists closure, as if the silence of the abandoned house has seeped into its memory. For the people of the region, the inn's legacy lives not in ruins, but in caution. Parents still tell their children, do not wander the old road at night. Do not trust every lantern you see. Not every hand that offers rest does so out of kindness. These are lessons both practical and symbolic, passed down long after the house itself collapsed into earth. Writers have called the story a parable of hospitality betrayed. Others see it as a reminder of human darkness, the thin line between neighbor and predator. Still others say it is simply what it appears to be, a frontier mystery that time will never solve. But perhaps its power lies not in what happened, but in what remains unknown. We cannot know whether the family fled, were punished, or turned upon each other. We cannot know how many travelers truly vanished, or whether Turner's testimony was a fragment of truth or a nightmare made real by fear. We cannot know what lay beneath the freshly turned earth, covered again before it could be examined. What we do know is this: the story continues. It is told in whispers and in classrooms, in scholarly articles and in fireside tales. The land where the house once stood is quiet now, grass bending under the wind, sky stretching unbroken above. Yet those who pass still report a chill, a sense of being watched, as though memory itself clings to the soil. Legends endure because they answer a need. They remind us that the world holds mysteries beyond our grasp, that beneath ordinary surfaces lie depths we cannot always fathom. They warn us that danger does not always roar from the woods. It sometimes smiles from a doorway, offering bread and rest. The vanished family left no graves, no farewell, no certainty. But in their absence, they left something perhaps more lasting. A story that refuses to fade. A riddle that outlives time. And as long as travelers ride lonely roads, seeking light in the darkness, the story of the inn will linger, waiting at the edge of memory, an unfinished meal, a locked door, and questions that echo like voices beneath the floorboards.